And hello, Hearts of Oak. Thanks so much for joining us once again. And I'm privileged to have on someone who actually guest hosts for Tony Perkins. And I was on with him a while ago, and he has come to Hearts of Oak to share a little bit of his background story on election integrity. And that's Jody Hice. Jody, thanks so much for your time today.
Peter, it's great to see you again, and it's an honor to join you today. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you. The honor's all mine. We're obviously your senior fellow at Family Research Council. You're congressman for 8 years in Georgia. Never been to Georgia, but been to lots of places. So I'm sure I will get there eventually. But you had a radio show, Let Freedom Reign, and you've been closely involved with the Family Research Council, obviously as senior fellow, and taking that hot seat from Tony Perkins whenever he is not able to host Washington Watch. But I've been going through your book. Maybe we can your recent book. I know you've published others, but Sacred Trust, Election Integrity, and the Will of the People. And all the links will be in the description for people to get hold of. And I would encourage anyone to get hold of that. And I think, I mean, the foreword Ken Black, we've got Ken Blackwell on in a week or so, as it happened. But anyone who has this written about them, this is from Ken Blackwell. I decided to dedicate a significant portion of my life to the battle for election integrity. Thankfully, I've not been alone in this fight. I've been proud to have Congressman Jody Hice as brother in arms and a dear friend alongside me at the bulwark. Congressman Hice's journey from a small Baptist parish to the epicenter of the 2020 presidential election is one of the most riveting and inspiring stories in recent congressional history. I don't know if I can add anything to that. That's phenomenal. And that's just on page one. But maybe you can touch a little bit on your background, Jody. The first chapter talks about growing up, your family, being a Baptist pastor. I grew up a pastor's kid, and my father was a Baptist pastor also. So growing up with that background, maybe touch on that before we get on to the political side.
Yeah, Peter, I never had aspirations to be a member of Congress. That really was not on my radar. I grew up in a family that loved the Lord. I grew up in church as a young boy. I felt called personally to be involved in ministry. And really, every decision I made since I was a young teenager was pointing in that direction to prepare for ministry and to prepare my heart for that. And so I was a pastor for almost 30 years, and that was my heart passion. But then we had a couple of battles that came our way that I never anticipated. One involved the ACLU, the other involved the IRS. They were years apart from one another. But both of those battles took on national attention, and I became, became the face of those battles and literally was kind of pushed out of the pulpit, so to speak, and pushed into the public arena to defend religious liberties. In both of those cases, they involved religious liberty issues. And I really got kind of pushed out of the pulpit into this arena that I did not go looking for, but it kind of came looking for me. And as a result, I ended up a local radio station contacted me and asked if I would give weekly updates as to what was happening with those cases and so forth. And that local program ended up being heard nationally. We ended up on some 400 stations every day. And one thing led to another. And eventually, my congressman decided to retire. And so it was an open seat. And we had a number of people call us and ask if I would consider running for Congress. And one thing led to another, and we felt strongly that was what we were supposed to do. And so I ended up after a long battle and after actually losing once in a runoff race. On the second time around, I won and ended up serving 4 terms in the United States Congress, and so it was a great honor, really the biggest honor of my life. I will say probably the biggest headache of my life as well, but it was a tremendous honor to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives, and but that's kind of my story in a nutshell.
I mean, those two cases you touched on are fascinating. The case of actually having Christian symbols in the classroom, in this case, the Ten Commandments, that you think is foundational, and yet is under repeated attack by many in society. But also the one with the IRS in pastors being able to actually speak into the political realm. And I know there's always a huge fear being a 501(c)(3) and whether you get that taken away. And you've actually entered that battle where I think in the UK, where I am, many pastors are fearful to actually tread in case their ramifications in terms of their charitable status. But tell me about those because they are essential, but they're also very different battles.
Yeah, they're very, very different battles, you're right, and they are both essential, and, we're living at a time where we have to take a stand for what we believe, otherwise we will lose the freedoms that we have always had, that we all grew up with, in both countries here, but the first one involving the ACLU was, as you mentioned, surrounded with the Ten Commandments. It was a battle over that. I was pastoring a church at that time that was a very influential church in our community. We had a number of county commissioners and that type of thing who are members of our church. And so we decided as a church that we would like to donate a copy of the Ten Commandments and give it to our county and put it in our county courthouse. So we bought the Ten Commandments. We posted them. We with our county commissioners. They went through all the processes to get it approved, and we literally put the Ten Commandments up in our county courthouse, and all was fine until the ACLU came after us and sued the county and came after members of our church who were part of the county commission. So literally, the ACLU lawsuit not only came against the county, but it literally walked right down the corridors of our church. And so, as a pastor, I felt it was the right thing to do to stand up for the Ten Commandments, obviously, but to also stand up for our church members and to stand up for our county. So it ended up that I went before our county commissioners, and I'll never forget this. The meeting that night was packed, standing room only. People were standing out in the parking, and stood before the commissioners and I told them, if you will stand and fight for this battle and for religious liberties and fight the ACLU, that I would pay for it so that it did not cost the taxpayers of Barrow County a dime. I'll pay for it if you'll fight for it. And Peter, they all kind of looked at each other and they said, "Sounds good. All in favor say aye, and any opposed say no." And I had no idea what I just stepped in, but it was a life changing moment. We ended up battling that case for 3 years, raised hundreds of thousands of dollars. We lost the case at the end of the road, and the commandments were ordered out of the courthouse at that point. And that was one of the darkest days of my life, I have to tell you. But at that point, after 3 years, we then turned our attention to the state, and for another 6 years, battled this issue with the state legislators in Georgia. And after 6 years, Governor Nathan Deal invited me to his office while he signed a law that stated that a 9 document historical display, which included the Ten Commandments, could now be posted in any government building in the state of Georgia. And if there was any lawsuit, that the state would fight the lawsuit, not the individual counties or cities. So the Ten Commandments went right back up in my county, and they've gone up all across the state of Georgia, everywhere. So we had full circle. That was the first case. And real quickly, the second case involving the IRS had to deal with what you were mentioning, what can and cannot be said from pulpits. And this in the United States is known as the Johnson Amendment, where Lyndon Johnson, when he was elected to state Senate way back in the 50s, I believe it was, he barely won that Senate race. And when he was elected to Senate, one of the first things he did was work out a deal with the IRS, saying that nonprofit organizations, which include churches, cannot be involved in political activity or they could potentially lose their tax exempt status. The reason he did that was because a bunch of nonprofits went after him They thought he was soft on communism. So a bunch of nonprofit organizations almost cost him the election. So he tried to turn it around and prevent nonprofits from being involved in the political process. And so again, I found that to be a reality. And I used to receive letters of intimidation from some of these organizations who basically said to me as a pastor that if you get, and not only to me, thousands of pastors receive these letters, but basically the letter would say if you get involved in speaking on these type of issues, you could be sued, your church could be sued, you could lose tax exempt status, on and on and on. And as a result, Peter, we had thousands of pastors and churches all across the country just self censor themselves right out of involving themselves in what the Bible has to say, even about moral and spiritual issues that politics were involved with. So I got involved with that and ended up being one of the primary leaders in that. Basically, I endorsed a candidate for president from the pulpit. We had tons of media presence that particular Sunday, and afterwards, I sent a letter to the IRS. I wrote a letter to the IRS along with a video of the sermon. And I basically said in the letter, here's what I did. I'm not trying to hide anything, but I don't believe I've broken the law. I have not violated the Constitution. In fact, I believe your IRS code is unconstitutional, and I challenge you to come after me. I did that along with 32 other pastors. Alliance Defending Freedom was our background legally to defend the case. The IRS did nothing, so we all got together and decided to do it again. The second time we had about 60 something, and that, Peter, that ended up to literally thousands and thousands of churches over the course of the next several years being engaged in what became known as Pulpit Freedom Sunday. And but anyways, the Johnson Amendment has no church, by the way, was ever attacked by the IRS. It was just simply the Johnson Amendment has just simply been used to intimidate churches into silence, intimidate pastors into silence. And that became the issue that drove me to run for Congress to repeal the Johnson Amendment, which, by the way, we did twice in the House, but both times it failed in the Senate. So, a long story around your question, but those were the two issues, both religious liberties issues. But we've got to stand. The believers have to take a stand, and otherwise, we will absolutely be run over in this current culture that we're living in.
Download the Getter app right now. It's totally free. It's where I put up exclusively all of my content 24 hours a day. You want to know what Steve Bannon's thinking? Go to Getter.
So don't wait. Download the Getter app now.
Sign up for free and be part of the movement.
Oh, we will. And I want to get into chapter 2, your first day in Congress, and then we'll jump on election integrity. But I would just want to ask you one more thing, because it's interesting. In the UK, we don't have a separation between church and state, and yet churches are fearful of actually speaking in the political sphere in terms of election. And you can have a candidate who is pro-abortion, 100%, who's full on with the LGBT lobby, who hates family, who hates biblical truth, and the church generally will say, if you want to vote for that person, that's okay. In the US, I remember being in Houston, goodness, 7, 8 years ago, and going to Second Baptist Church in Houston, and had met Reverend Ed Young kind of a few days before. And I went there. I thought, I need to go. I've heard about Second Baptist Church Houston, and Tucker Carlson was speaking that Saturday evening. And it was a boldness of saying, this is what we believe as a church that has to affect your political views and how you vote. How does that work in a country that seems to have that separation, and yet there are churches that are bold despite maybe the fear, and you've been involved in that battle? So I mean, expand on a little bit. Is it just individual pastors that have courage, or is it a pervasive culture that encourages pastors in the US to speak up?
Well, first of all, the concept of separation of church and state is not public policy. It came from a letter simply a letter that was written to Thomas Jefferson, where some individuals from Danbury, Connecticut, were very concerned that the proposed Constitution was not providing religious liberties that we needed. And in response to that personal letter, Johnson wrote back to them, assuring them that there was a wall of separation. And what he was talking about in that letter was that the wall prohibited the federal government from interfering with the religious liberty issues and what can be said, what can be done, what can be said from pulpits, what can be practiced in the public square by believers. There was a wall of separation that prohibited government from interfering with the religious beliefs and activities of people of faith. And that was the letter. It was the first time, to my knowledge, and the only time in American history that a personal letter has somehow turned into public policy that now we hear frequently: separation of church and state. And what they mean by that is that the church cannot be involved in politics. That's totally in violation to our First Amendment, which guarantees the right of all citizens, both religious liberties and freedom of speech and so forth. And so when you're talking freedom of speech and religious liberties, the center of that, of course, would be the church, the synagogues, whatever it may be. And the epicenter of that would be the pulpits. And so for the government, which we have in the Johnson Amendment, to start coming in and start intimidating what can and cannot be said from the pulpits is totally in violation of our First Amendment. So we have the right in this country, protected, guaranteed as an inalienable right under God, to speak what we believe and to practice those things in the public square without fear of intimidation or harassment by our federal government. That, however, is being challenged. And so we are having to instruct people and encourage people of faith and pastors to utilize the Constitution and to speak boldly biblical truth into the political environment and the cultural environment in which we live. And that's what you experienced at Second Baptist Houston. And that's what many churches across this country still participate in. And unfortunately, we've had many back away from that because they have believed the erroneous concept of separation of church and state, which, as I said, is not public policy. It's just a personal letter to and from Thomas Jefferson to a group of Danbury Baptists in Connecticut.
Well, thank God we have strong pastors who take the view of God much more than they take the view of politicians. Can I? You talk about, it was fascinating reading your first days in Congress, chapter 2, and all around really partially around the vote for the Speaker John Boehner, and this whole concept being a mere formality, and you standing on one side on integrity and suddenly finding yourself pushed into a vote. What was that whole going from the pulpit to Congress, and the first experience, probably the early experience, finding out that actually something you went in to stand for, suddenly you find yourself on the wrong side? And tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that was really my first official day in Congress. And, I tell people sometimes I went from the swearing in to the swearing at pretty quickly. And that was the occasion. But I had run on. John Boehner was an individual that was just, he was moderate at best, was not a strong leader for conservative causes. And so I ran my race going into Congress as saying that I would vote against John Boehner once I get there. He was the Speaker of the House, and so I had said that I would vote against him. Well, what I did not know, Peter, was that voting process consists of two steps. The first step is a vote that takes place among the Republicans. I'm Republican, so our conference in the House of Representatives, we were the majority, so we got to vote on who was going to be the Speaker of the House. And so the first vote was among our conference to vote on John Boehner. And in that vote, they made it difficult. They did it by voice rather than by secret ballot. And so when the time came for the vote, they said all in favor of John Boehner say aye, and there was a big roar, aye. Everyone said aye. And then they said anyone who opposes say no. And I remember just as loud as I could be, I hollered out no. And I still to this day, I can still hear my voice echoing through that building. I was like the lone voice that said no. And this was my first day in Congress, and I recall people all over the place turning around as if to say, "Who was that idiot? Just voted against John Boehner?" But I said no. Well, afterwards, from the speaker himself to other leaders came to me and said, "Look, you have now fulfilled your promise to your constituents. You voted against John Boehner. But," they said, "you likewise heard the vote and the will of the conference. And so now is a time for unity. Now is a time that we go out on the House floor and we speak in a unified way and we vote in favor of the speaker because that is the will of the conference, as you just saw." And Peter, that made sense to me. I mean, I had voted against him. I was loud in my opposition, but I didn't realize that the second vote was really the one that mattered. They deceived me into thinking that the one that mattered was the one that we just had voted on. So after some deliberation and consideration, I finally agreed. I said, "Well, okay, I understand the importance of unity, and so I'll do so." So to keep my word, I I did that. But to my shock, there were, I believe, 19, I believe that was the number, Republicans who voted against John Boehner. And I was sitting there on the House floor saying, "Where were you people when we just voted a little while ago?" And it was a horrifying experience. And so the only public vote that people saw was the vote that was on the floor. And here I was as someone who had run saying I would vote against John Boehner, but the vote, as it was public knowledge, the one that counted was the one that I said that I ended up voting for him. But, that was a dark, dark, hard beginning to Congress, but it was probably the best thing that could happen to me because I learned on my very first day how that place operated. And you've got to keep your guard up, and you cannot assume that people are telling the truth. And so that was a miserable day, but it was a great learning experience. In fact, shortly afterwards, we started the Freedom Caucus. That was a whole nother venture of standing against that type of deception that came from leadership and others.
Definitely a bad first day in the office, Jody. That
Yes, it was.
definitely is up there. You mentioned the Freedom Caucus, and I think chapter 4, you talk about going in and meeting with President Trump in the Oval Office, part of the Freedom Caucus, and I think this was to do with the American Healthcare Act, and there was a line from, I think it's this: "To the best of my ability, I looked straight in the eye and said, 'Mr. President, you can count on me for many things, but I cannot support this bill.'" I mean, that takes, you don't say no to President Trump. That takes a lot to actually say, "I'm going to stick with what I believe because this is wrong," despite the fact that actually it may cause me huge headaches politically. What was that? The Freedom Caucus, but I guess standing against that, was that the repeal of Obamacare or an alternative?
Yeah, it was the so-called repeal of Obamacare, but we had at that time John Boehner, from the story I just mentioned, ended up losing when was said and done. As we started the Freedom Caucus, and John Boehner ended up resigning, and replacing him was Paul Ryan. And Paul Ryan was not a whole lot better, quite frankly, than John Boehner, if any. I'll just put it that way. And so John Boehner came up with this idea to so-called repeal Obamacare, but it did nothing of that. In fact, it really entrenched some of the major aspects of Obamacare into law. And so and at that time, the Freedom Caucus, which had been developed by the time Paul Ryan became the speaker, we were strongly opposed to that piece of legislation. Well, in the meantime, President Trump had been elected, And after probably about 3 months or so, after maybe less than that, I'd have to go back and recall. But President Trump, I had an invitation to go to the White House. Now, before Trump, Obama was president, so I never had an invitation to the White House under him. So finally, Trump is in the White House, and he's having different members come, and I received an invitation to come. Well, I was excited. That was, as a member of Congress, my first trip to the White House. So I went there only to find out, I believe there were about 18 other members of Congress who were all also there. And, I kind of overlooked that, thinking, well, it makes sense. He's trying to cover as much ground as he can. So we were all in the cabinet room, and the president came in. And I'll tell you, President Trump is a fascinating person. He's exceedingly funny and enjoyable to be with. But when it's time for business, he's all business. But otherwise, he's a delightful individual, a lot of fun. So we were just having a lot of fun. He was cracking jokes. We were all laughing and really enjoying our time in the White House and in the cabinet room. And then he said, "How many of you would like to go into the Oval Office? Have never been there?" And of course, we're all saying, "By all means, this would be awesome." So we go into the Oval Office, Peter, and there's on one end of that office is his desk. On the other end is a fireplace. There was a nice heavy chair right in front of the fireplace. And then there were chairs lined up kind of in horseshoe fashion going around the room from one side of the fireplace, making a circle, coming back around to the other. And as soon as I walked into the Oval Office, I realized this was no just sight of the moment comment for us to go into the Oval Office. There was something intentional going in here because they had all these seats already in place for us. And so we all had our seat. He was right in front of the fireplace. Again, he's talking about pictures on the wall and different things about the Oval Office. And then from the back of the room, one of our leaders in the Republican Party said, "Mr. President, I think now would be a good time for you to go around this room and ask where these different members stand on the piece of legislation that we're about to consider." Well, President Trump was for that legislation. He thought indeed it was going to repeal Obamacare as well. And I thought, oh no, because I knew he was for it. I knew I was against it. And President said, "I think that's a good idea." So he looked to the person immediately to his left and said, "Where do you stand on this bill?" And just stared at him. And he said, "Oh, Mr. President, I'm with you 100%. I'm totally in favor of this bill, blah, blah, blah." And he started going down this line. The next person did the same. Peter, there were 6 people in a row that just said, "Yes, Mr. President, I'm all in favor of this bill. Whatever you want, I'm going to stand with you." And I have never wanted to get out of a room any more than I did at that moment because I was next. And he looked at me and said, "Where do you stand on this bill?" And as you just read there, I said, "Mr. President, I can't support this." And sure enough, he raked me over the coals for what seemed like an hour. But then the person in the back of the room who had suggested we go through this process came up to me in the back of my ear and said, "You cannot say no to the President of the United States." And I heard that, and something I'll tell you, for some people, maybe they've been intimidated with that, but with me, that just made me dig my heels in even more because I said, "Oh yes, I can. I'm not in favor of this." And the president, I looked up, and he was glaring at me, and I said, "Mr. President, I cannot support this bill." And he chewed me out a little bit more. And then he went to the next person who was also in the Freedom Caucus, and he loudly, in fact, he hit his head on the hand on the chair rail. He said, "I'm a no. I won't vote for it." The next guy was also in Freedom Caucus. He said he was a no. And then we just started having an avalanche of people saying, "I'm not going to support this bill." And one thing led to another. And that bill did not pass. And the president came to recognize right then that in order to pass legislation of significance, he needed the Freedom Caucus on board. So we actually became good friends over time. Everyone in the Freedom Caucus and personally over the course of time really developed a very enjoyable and respectful relationship with President Trump. But it started off on rocky ground.
We'll knock it in. Chapter 4 is fascinating. Your experiences in Congress. We'll knock it in. I want to jump to chapter 5. Democrats push for election reform, and you talk about kind of the push to federalize elections from the Democrats, and of course the whole COVID-19 issue, and that being used as a way of, I guess, suppressing individuals' rights through mail-ins, weaker verification, and absentee ballots. All of that. Tell us a little bit about that. Was that, and then you lead into Georgian and standing up for election. That's a little bit later in the election in 2020, but that whole, I guess, re-understanding what it means for election integrity, it's assumed it's there, but it's only there if you actually fight for it. And you became involved seeing the failings through the COVID side, and then actually standing in 2020 and just not accepting it.
Yeah, that's right, Peter. At the end of the day, elections are not about who wins or loses. Elections are about the will of the people. And what did the people say that they wanted? And whenever you have anything that interferes with an accurate portrayal of the will of the people, then you have election problems. As long as the people are able to make their voice known, there's always hope for change in the future. Even if your candidate at the present loses, if there's fair elections and the will of the people is guarded and protected, then you can always come back later and win next time around. But when election integrity is compromised, there are serious problems, and to the extent that many times, regardless of the will of the people, it can never be reversed if election integrity is compromised. And so we started seeing some signs of that. I suppose in every election there's some degree of fraud or something that takes place in some way. But when you're talking on mass scale, it becomes an exceedingly serious threat to the will of the people and the entire purpose for which elections exist in the first place, which again is to protect the will of the people. So we started seeing some of this as soon as COVID came around. I was on the oversight committee. There was, the best that we can determine, the first case of COVID in December and of that year, 2019, I believe it was. And the very next week after that first case, we started. The Democrats were in charge at that time. Obama was president. The Democrats controlled what hearings we would have. We had our first case in the United States in January of 2020 of COVID. The very next week after the first case, we had a hearing that we're going to have. We need to reform our elections because COVID is going to become a pandemic, so to speak, and this type of terminology started to flow out. We had one case, and yet there was already this portrayal that we're going to have to send out ballots to everyone. We're going to, regardless of the integrity of the voting files, and we're going to have to send out ballots, and like you were talking about, mail-in ballots, all this stuff. And we were not even in a pandemic when these hearings started getting underway. I recall thinking that was very suspicious in my mind, but at that point, I could never have anticipated what COVID was going to bring forth, nor could I have imagined what these hearings were going to push various states to do in terms of changing their election law and compromising election integrity that we had. But COVID became the springboard. It became the excuse for changing all sorts of election laws and protections and guardrails. And as a result, we created in this country an absolute mess in my opinion, when it comes to election integrity. And even to this day, we're continually trying to bring back some of the safeguards that were lost during the COVID timeframe.
And again, that fighting in Georgia, what, only 11,779 votes out of 5 million. And we saw that in a number of states, razor thin. Um, and you talk about your objections to actually certifying that. That what was that? I mean, that period of putting yourself on a limb because it didn't add up, and therefore you weren't just going to rubber stamp that. Huge pressure just to go along and just accept, but you didn't see it was right. You were concerned about irregularities. What I mean, I think that high pressure environment we have not seen for a long time. Back in the Gore Bush, it was one state, and this was across the board in many states. What was that battle for you like personally?
Yeah, that was quite a battle. That all came down to January 6th, which most people know now as the day that so-called there was an insurrection in the Capitol, which certainly was not the case. That again was exaggerated tremendously, but nonetheless, without getting into the details of all of that, because Georgia had some strong election question marks that were very concerning. In fact, the state Senate had done an in-depth study of the election in Georgia, and one of their committees actually said there are so many irregularities. William Ligon was the chairman of this particular committee. He came out and said that there are so many irregularities, so many problems with this election in Georgia. This should absolutely not be certified until we have clarification and so on and so forth. Well, I'm a representative of Georgia, a representative of my district, but also a representative of Georgia. And here is our state Senate committee, subcommittees that is focused on elections in Georgia. And they said this was a disaster. So I felt obligated. Somebody's got to stand up in their behalf and say, yes, I'm going to join you to say, let's pump the brakes. Let's stop this thing until we find out what's going on. And so I became the objection to the Georgia's certification on that infamous day there in January 6th. And I rose to challenge our election certification. And what's required in that situation is a member of Congress objects, and then there has to be a senator to second that objection. We had a senator agreeing to join us in that, but following the days, the events that took place on that particular day, our Georgia senator backed down, and so the challenge from Georgia it died. It went nowhere.
Wow. Um, uh, Generally, in election integrity, as we come to the end, I think Chapter 11, Principles of Secure Elections, you talk about you talk about actually how you secure elections, accurate voter rolls, proper postal data, photo IDs, limited mail-ins, penalties for fraud. Yeah, I'll not get into my thoughts on you guys having like a vote for like a month or however long. But we have our feelings in the UK, so I'm not pointing the finger. Tell me where you see the US at the moment. I saw Scott Pressler talking about Republicans are going to lose in the midterms. I think he was talking about getting the vote out as opposed to actually combating voter fraud. And with some states being for this, I saw Texas has brought in what was it 9 states actually discussing together about election integrity. How do you see the current situation with all the talk after 2020 in terms of fraudulent ballots, in terms of early voting, in terms of drop boxes, in terms of dead people voting, etc., etc., etc. How do you see 2025?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Peter. And when all is said and done, we will wait and see. The situation we face in the United States is our Constitution leaves the issue mostly to the states. Our Constitution says the time, place, and manner of elections are left to the individual states. So, although the federal government may have a role to set some general parameters to safeguard election integrity. The biggest bulk of the issue is left to the individual states. So, what we are seeing here in the U.S. is the blue states are doing very little to protect, as a general rule, doing very little, if anything, to protect election integrity. In fact, they're tipping the scales clearly, seemingly at least, in their direction. Whereas, on the other hand, we have most of the red states are really tightening down on election integrity. My own state of Georgia has been dealing with a number of the issues that you just referenced to try to secure election integrity here in our own state. So we're going to have, probably 26, 27 states that are going to enact some pretty stringent election integrity laws going into the upcoming election. And then we've got a number of other states that are not going to do so. So it's going to be very interesting to see what comes out of it. I do, deep down, I believe we're going to see greater election integrity nationally certainly than what we have seen in the past, because it is such a heightened issue of importance to people all across the country. And when you shine the light on things, integrity seems to enter in, where the light just exposes darkness, so to speak. So, as this is an issue of tremendous public exposure, I'm anticipating that we're going to have greater integrity than we have had in the past. But we're going to have to wait and see. I think, as you mentioned, yes, historically, the party that is in control typically loses in midterm elections. So that is a negative for Republicans. But on the other hand, the Democrats are polling historically lower than they have ever polled in this country. People are fed up with the radical left wing, nonsensical stances that they are taking. So I think it's going to be very difficult for them to get out the vote. I do believe, on the other hand, people appreciate what President Trump and conservatives in this country are moving from, everything from the economy to gender identity and women and being overtaken by men in their sports and a host of things like that. I still think it's going to be a good, strong election at this point for conservatives and Republicans.
Yeah, because I do my last thought. I don't know if you look back in the history and seen an individual in the White House who is so confident, who has such a support base that is so wide. Of course, you take the horrendous events of the assassination of Charlie Kirk into that in terms of Christians and their ability to speak truth. But you take all of that against the other side that doesn't seem to have a natural leader as such, and maybe afraid. It's like David and Goliath, afraid to go up against the Goliath. And it seems as though the left are afraid to put someone up. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that as we finish?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. President Trump is one of the most fascinating individuals I've ever known in my life. He is just so street smart. He is savvy. He's just smart in general. He's a great communicator. He is connected with the people of this country in ways that I have never witnessed before in my life. It's absolutely fascinating. And the other side has just been so filled with hatred towards him that they are willing to do almost anything to silence him and try to obstruct what he's doing in opposition to, again, the will of the people who have voted him in, and a majority both in the House and the Senate. And the American people are seeing that, and they don't like what they are seeing from the left. And so I think we're in a good position right now to continue the momentum. Thank God that President Trump has been able to provide for us in this country.
No, absolutely. Well, I encourage people to get hold of the book, Sacred Trust, Election Integrity, and the Will of the People. Published, it was last year, wasn't it? It was published.
Right, that's
Yes,
correct.
last. So, a fantastic insight into not only Jody's background, but also the whole election integrity and where we are at the moment. And it's not just a US victory that we had to President Trump. It's been a world victory in terms of pushing back into the woke agenda. But Jody, really appreciate you coming along. Enjoyed being with you as you stood in for Tony on Washington Watch, and thanks for giving us your time today.
It's great to be with you. Look forward to having you back on Washington Watch and appreciate you having me. Have a great day.